Hello there. When I got my first sales job, I was selling soap. It was called Rosamel Beauty Soap from door to door. And I was a young kid. I was 11 or 12. I was working my way to YMCA camp, and I thought everybody needed soap. Soap should be so easy to sell. Even if people had soap, they would buy more because it was a good cause, and I was a nice kid, and they would help me go to camp. So I went around knocking on doors, and I'd say, hello, my name's Brian Tracy. I'm working my way to YMCA camp selling Rosamel Beauty Soap. Would you like to buy a box? And then I got the most shocking experience of my life. I could not believe the number of reasons people had for not buying a 50-cent box of soap. They started saying things that you've never heard before, such as, they would say, well, we can't afford it. We're not in the market right now. We don't use that brand in our house. We prefer a different brand or supplier. Business is slow. Cash is bad. I have to talk with someone else. Could you leave some information? Could you get back to us in a week, a month, a year, maybe next season? And on and on and on. And I was just shocked. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought there was something wrong with my soap. And then I realized that wasn't the case at all. And that's what we're going to talk about in this session. Now, here is my great discovery, and it kind of changed my life. The fact is that objections are a normal and natural and unavoidable part of the sales process. And here's one of the most important points which we continue to reaffirm. It is that objections are not personal. Rejection is not personal. When a person gives you an objection about your product or service, don't take it personally. It's just a normal and natural part of the selling process. And so it has to be like water off a duck's back. You just have to smile and just keep on sailing. Now, nonetheless, even though I've said this, most salespeople become discouraged and disheartened when the customer begins to object to their offerings on the basis of high price, better offers from competitors, and other reasons. In fact, I found that customers go to customer school where they learn an entire list of objections which they can trot out as soon as you say hello. Now, the fact is that today, customers are bombarded by hundreds and even thousands of commercial messages every day, especially with the internet, radio, television, newspaper, billboards. They are deluged. It's almost like a city under bombardment with cannons from all sides. Unless they are quick on their feet, they'd be overwhelmed with the number of offers that are saying, buy me, buy me, buy me. So as a result of this bombardment, customers are skeptical, they're suspicious, and they're careful with their time and their money. They have to be cautious or they'd be overwhelmed. So no matter what you are selling, customers will have questions and concerns that you must resolve before you can proceed to a sale. Your ability to handle these questions and concerns is a key skill that is essential to your sales success. Now, in this lesson, you're going to learn some of the key questions and responses that you need to effectively answer any objection that a customer can ask of you. Here's the first rule. There are no sales without objections of some kind. You should always remember the following. Objections are good. They indicate interest in your product or service. If you're talking to a prospect and the prospects say nothing, no, yes, no, 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 nodding the head, nothing, this is not a good sign. It's only when the customer starts to say, well, what about this, or what about that, or how do you justify this? It means that the customer is starting to become interested. Now, objections indicate that you have touched on an emotional nerve of the prospect. You've actually caused the prospect to care about your offering. Sometimes we would ask, what is the opposite of love? And people would often say, hate. No, the opposite of love is indifference, not caring at all. And so when the prospect begins to object, it means that they care. Now, here's the result of millions of dollars of research, more than 55,000 videotaped sales conversations. What they found is that successful sales have twice as many objections as unsuccessful sales. Sometimes the person will say, I don't want it, don't need it. I can't use it, can't afford it, I'm not in the market, I'm happy with my existing supplier. Okay, I'll take it. The more the customer objects, it turns out the more likely it is that they'll buy. Now, one of the most important things I learned as a young salesman was what was called the law of 6. It's one of the most powerful principles you can use for identifying and overcoming objections. The law of 6 says that the number of objections to your product or service, whatever it is limited to no more than 6. Now, in the course of a week or a month, you may get hundreds of objections, but if you write them down on paper and then you sort them out into categories, you'll find that they fall into about 6 main categories, depending on what your product or service is. Sometimes people come up to me in my seminars and they say, what are the 6? And I say the 6 depends upon what you're selling, your competitors, the market, your customer, and a whole lot of other things. So you must first determine your 6 major objections. And the way you do is you ask yourself this question. You say, we could sell to everyone if our prospects didn't just say the following words. Sometimes we call this a sentence completion exercise. You make a list of all the objections you get in a week or a month, and then you divide them into 6 logical categories. You know, a logical category is the price is too high. Another one is it's not suitable for our uses, our needs, or we're happy with a different supplier. But look and listen to what people say and give you as reasons not to buy, and then develop bulletproof answers to every common objection. I've worked with salespeople, by the way, who've gone from the bottom to the top, gone from struggling to earning more than $1 million a year in straight commission sales, and every one of them has taken the time to listen and identify what are the reasons that my customers give me for not buying, and how could I answer those reasons in such a way that the objection disappears. So the key question in answering objections is always, why don't our prospects buy our product or service from us? What reason do they give for not buying, and how could we neutralize that reason? Now, there are 4 specific times when it is appropriate to deal with objections. The first time is immediately, as soon as the objection comes up. And this you do if the objection has to do with your integrity or the integrity of your company or the quality of your product or service. You have to deal with this immediately up front. You can't let it go past, because if you don't, the prospect will assume that what they said was true. I'll give you an example. The prospect says, oh yes, I hear your company's products were all recalled because of quality problems. Answer, no, you're thinking of ABD Company. We're actually ABC Company. ABD Company had a lot of quality control problems last year, but ABC Company, our company, has never had that problem, and we get very high ratings with Consumer Reports. In other words, you must neutralize a quality or integrity question immediately before you can go on, or there'll be a major block in the customer's mind that will make the sale impossible. Now, a second time you can answer objections is during the presentation, when the objection comes up naturally or when you bring it up. Often you can say, you know, at this point, our customers often ask, how is it you can charge so much when competitors charge so little? And so we like to explain it this way. Sometimes you can bring up an objection, or it'll come up naturally. Like, how do I know that this is the best for me since it's so new? Well, we've had it thoroughly tested and vetted by some of the top organizations in the country, and it's equal to or better than anything out there. You answer the objection when it comes up. The third time you can answer objection is later. Always delay or defer an objection, especially a price objection, until the appropriate time. Customers say, well, how much is it? You say, that's a great question. I'm going to come to that in just a second, and I think you'll be delighted when you hear the price. But put off the price objection until you get a chance to understand the customer's needs and present your product or service as the ideal solution. Remember, the more the prospect wants it, the lower is their price resistance and the less intense will be their objections. The last time to answer an objection is never. Some objections are merely knee-jerk responses. Oh, what about this, or what about that? And you just smile and nod and say, well, that's a good question. I'm going to get to that in a second. And just keep on. Don't let the customer knock you off your game. One of the techniques you can use in handling objections is to use what is called the preemptive strike method. And you do this with common objections. And the way you do it is you anticipate the objection. You know the customer is going to bring it up sooner or later. and you bring it up before the customer mentions it. I was working with a division of a Fortune 500 company, and their products and services were about 20-25% higher than the market, and their salespeople were completely demoralized because their competition had taken out big comparison ads in the papers. So they'd walk in talk to a prospect, and they say, "Hi, I'm from ABC Company," and they say, "We know about you guys. You're the most expensive in the market." So this is what we trained them to do, and it was revolutionary. When they called on a prospect, they would go in and say, "Hello, my name's Brian Tracy. I'm from ABC Company, and you know something? We charge more than anybody else in the national market. Would you like to know why?" That immediately caused them to say, "Well, yeah, why?" "Well, just give me a couple of minutes, and I'll show you why paying us more is much more to your advantage than paying less for our competitor's product." Their sales went up 70% in the first month when they began to use this approach to an objection they knew they were going to hear sooner or later. So answer the objection clearly and straightforwardly so that it is out of the way. I always ask, does that answer your question? So the prospect says, yes, that answers my question. Good. Then you can continue. Now, when you get an objection, here's another technique. Treat the objection as a request for more information. For example, the prospect says, "How can you justify the price?" I say, "That is a good question. Why does it cost as much as it does? We're not in the market right now. That is a good question. Why should you be in the market today rather than waiting until a later time?" Complement the objection. Encourage further objections by saying, "That's a good question." Whenever you say, "That's a good question," you encourage the person to ask more questions. And you want the prospect to feel free to ask you any question or bring up any objection for a reason. If a prospect has one objection left in their mind that they don't share with you, that will serve as a block to the sale, and it will end with the prospect saying, "Well, let me think it over." And of course, they never will. Now, each prospect has key objections that you must get out on the table, and therefore the rule is make it easy for them to object. Hear the objection out completely, be patient, nod, smile, lean forward, practice your listening skills, practice your trust-building skills, so the customer feels very, very comfortable just telling you anything that's on their mind. Now, there are several different strategies that you can use for answering objections effectively in the sales conversation. The first strategy, you can say this: "Obviously, you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is?" "Your price is too high." "Obviously, you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is?" Which is a compliment, and then you remain perfectly silent and lean forward and listen. You're complimenting the prospect by saying, "Obviously, you have a good reason," which means that you have thought it out thoroughly, so that's the reason you're saying it, and often they don't have a good reason at all. One of my favorite techniques is you can ask these words. When the prospect says, "I can get it cheaper from your competitors," or "I can get a better deal from someone else," you use these magic words, "How do you mean?" or "How do you mean exactly?" I had a top salesman who was asked, "What did you learn from Brian Tracy's programs that enabled you to become so successful?" And he replied, "How do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I mean, what specific techniques did you learn from Brian Tracy?" He said, "How do you mean exactly?" And he said, "Well, what I wanted to know what," and then he said, "That's what I learned." The question, "How do you mean?" "How do you mean?" increased his sales 5 times over the following year. Now, whenever you ask the question, "How do you mean?" they will always expand on their previous answer and give you more information and give you an opportunity to continue with the sale. Always answer an objection with a question rather than with an answer if you possibly can. Person says that costs too much. You say, "That's a good question. Why does it cost as much as it does?" Or, "How much do you think something like this should cost?" Remember, the person who asks questions has control. Use objections as an opportunity to build trust by listening intently. Remember the rule, listening builds trust. And even if the person is objecting, if you're listening really closely to the answer and nodding and smiling and not interrupting, their level of trust goes up and their level of price resistance and all forms of resistance goes down. Another technique is to use the feel, felt, found method of dealing with price objections. When the prospect says something like, "That sounds really expensive," you respond with, "I understand exactly how you feel." This is empathy and bridge building. Others felt the same way when they first heard our price. That means you're not alone. Others in the market had the same concern. And then the third statement is, "But this is what they found when they began using our product." I understand exactly how you feel. Others felt the same way, but this is what they found. And then you give a logical reason why the value and benefit of your product or service more than justifies the higher price. Now, most objections, and most lost sales for that matter, arise from what is called fuzzy understanding. If the customer is not crystal clear about your offering and why it is good for him or her, the prospect will say, "Let me think it over. Let me think about it." And those words in all languages mean goodbye forever, because they never will think about it. There's a mental block. They're not clear why they should buy it. They're not clear that because of the problem your product will solve is not clear to the prospect. Or the need that your product will satisfy for the prospect is not clear. Or the benefits of your product or service are not clear. Or the unique selling proposition of your product or service, the one thing that your product or service will do for this customer that no other product or service will do, is unclear. And who's responsible? It's always the salesperson who is responsible for not making it clear. Now, the final reason why people don't buy is because there's no urgency for the prospect to take action, or he sees no reason to act now rather than at some other time. That's why we say that if there's no urgency, there's no sale. And one of the things that you do with your company is you try to think of something that you can add at the end of the conversation to create urgency. Like, if you purchase it by the end of this week, there's a special price or discount or additional service or something else. Now, there are several proven ways for you to deal with price objections, which come up in almost every sale. When the prospect says, "Your price is too high," you respond by asking, "Why do you say that?" And then remain perfectly silent and listen to what he or she says. And whatever they say, you expand by saying, "How do you mean exactly?" Or you can say, "Why do you feel that way? I can get it cheaper somewhere else. Why do you feel that way?" And listen and hear out the answer. And then ask, "How do you mean exactly?" Another great answer when a person says, "How much is it? How much is it? How much is it?" Before you've had a chance to explain, you stop and you say, "Mr. Prospect, is price your only concern? Are you going to buy something like this, as important as it is, solely on the basis of price, or do you have other concerns as well?" You want the prospect to say, "No, price is not the only reason. Quality, delivery, service, reputation, dependabilities, guarantees, warranties, these are all important as well." And then the last question you can ask when the prospect says, "That's more than I expected to pay," is, "How far apart are we?" You see, you could be only a short distance apart, and you can justify that distance by showing the extra value and benefits that the customer receives for the small difference in price. How far apart are we? A friend of mine used to say, when someone said it cost too much, he would say, "How much too much does it cost?" And of course, the customer never had an answer for that. Now, if the prospect insists on knowing your price before you have identified the needs and presented your benefits, delay the price conversations by saying these words. "Mr. Prospect, I know price is important to you. May I come back to that in a minute?" Whenever you ask a "may I" question, they'll almost always say, "Okay, I'm going to answer that thoroughly in just a minute. Can I come back to that in a couple of minutes? Would that be okay?" And the prospect says, "Okay, then you can continue the presentation and bring the price up later in the conversation." Now, if the customer still insists on knowing the price before he allows you to give a presentation, use this method. When the prospect says, "How much is it?" you say, "Mr. Prospect, that's the best part. If it's not exactly right for you, there's no charge. And this always stops the prospect, especially on the phone. They say, what do you mean there's no charge? Well, Mr. Prospect, if it's not exactly right for you, you're not going to buy it, are you? Well, absolutely not. Well, then if you don't buy it, there's no charge. And they immediately stop and say, oh yeah, that's right. Please go ahead. So the formula for dealing with objections is to answer the objection, provide proof in the forms of letters or testimonials or numbers from some other source, ask for confirmation, does that make sense to you so far, and then proceed with your sales presentation. So remember that objections are the rungs on the ladder to sales success. The more objections you get, the more interested the prospect is in buying your product or service. When you hear an objection, you should be thankful and then begin turning the objection into reasons for buying. The more objections you hear, the more sales you're going to make, and the more money you're going to make, as long as you handle them calmly and professionally. Now, here are some questions that you can ask and answer in the area of overcoming objections. First of all, what are the 3 most common objections that you receive when you contact a prospect for the first time, especially reasons for not giving you an appointment or a hearing? Question number 2, complete this sentence. I could sell to everyone I spoke to as long as they just didn't say ... What is it that people say to stop themselves from buying your product or service? Question number 3, what are the 3 most common objections that you receive at the end of the sales conversation for not buying what you're selling? What is it that people say at the end that causes you to be back on the street or back in your car? Number 4, what are 3 ways that you can deal with a price objection, specifically when the customer says your price is too high? Number 5, what are the 3 most powerful statements that you use to neutralize objections in the course of your sales conversation? Number 6, what are 3 things that you can do to make it easy for the customer to object and to express any concerns that he or she might have about buying your product or service? And question number 7, what are 3 examples of fuzzy understanding that customers might have that would cause them to hold back from buying your product or service at the end of your presentation? And finally, what one action are you going to take immediately to become more effective at overcoming objections in your career?